Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be learning the halachas of leaving food on the fire on Friday into Shabbos. So one of the standard Shabbos products of a Jewish home is a blech, and a lot of people are familiar with the fact that there are many halachas involved with the blech. We will today discuss one of the main reasons why we have a blech and different halachas that apply with leaving food on top of a blech. So the halacha is, min ha'Torah, biblically, if somebody puts a pot of raw food on the fire right before Shabbos and is going to cook for a number of hours into Shabbos, min ha'Torah, biblically, he is not doing anything wrong. He's not violating Shabbos. He's not violating the malach of cooking because he put the food on the fire before Shabbos. It could be a minute before Shabbos, whatever it is. The act of cooking was completed from the person's perspective right when you put the food on right when you put the pot on the fire. The fact that it's only going to become ready during Shabbos, that does not involve any biblical prohibition whatsoever because the food is cooking on its own. So min ha'Torah, biblically, there's no reason you would technically need a blech on the fire to leave your food for Shabbos. Nevertheless, the Chachamim made a number of restrictions if a person is leaving food on the fire. And the reason why they made these restrictions is because in the olden days, people used to cook on coals. They used to cook with a cooking utensil called the kira. A kira was like a square box. As you see in this picture over here, there was like a square box, and there was coals on the bottom of the box where the fire was burning. And on top of this box, there was two round holes on which you could put two pots, or you could suspend the pots partially over into this box, and that's how it would cook. The standard fuel that was used in the olden days was they didn't have gas or electric. They used coals. They used to put wood, which eventually turned into coal. And the way, if you cook with coals, anyone that knows, if they're making a barbecue or anything like that, you have to constantly stir the coals. Every few minutes or at some point, the coals are going to die down. And while there will still be some heat generated, if you want the cooking process to be done quickly and on time, you would stir the coals. So like this, the fire rejuvenates and the heat gets stronger, intensifies, and able to cook the food and get it ready on time. Now, stirring the coals involves a number of isurim min ha'Torah. If a person would stir the coals on Shabbos, it would involve a number of biblical prohibitions. First of all, stirring the coals involves the biblical prohibition of maver, the malach of igniting a fire, kindling a flame. It also would involve the malach of mevashil, of cooking. If the food is not fully cooked and you are stirring the coals in order to get the flame to cook the food quicker and faster, that would violate a malacha of bishul, of mevashil, of cooking. Although you put the food on the fire before Shabbos, but since you're doing an activity which is accelerating the cooking process, that involves a biblical prohibition of bishul. But even if the food were to have been fully cooked, stirring the coals technically still involves a biblical prohibition of maver, of igniting a flame. And it also usually simultaneously involves the prohibition of machaba, of extinguishing. Why? Because usually when you stir the coals, some coals ignite and the flame shoots up even more, but there are always a few coals that stirring them causes them to actually the flame should diminish. It should get extinguished a little bit, which involves a malacha of machab, of extinguishing. So stirring the coals was something which the Chachamim were strongly concerned a person would do, even if he's not violating a biblical prohibition by leaving the food on the fire right before Shabbos. But since the usual way of cooking with a kira in the olden times was they would every once in a while stir the coals. So the Chacham were afraid that a person would stir the coals in order to make sure he'll have his food ready for Friday night. And doing so would involve a number of isurim derais, a number of biblical prohibitions. So therefore they wanted to set certain things into place to make sure that a person does not stoke the coals. So what things did they institute to prevent the person from stirring the coals? So in general, we're going to see there's a few basic halachas, a few basic restrictions that they made. There's a few conditions that they set up. And the point is like this. There's a few things we have to focus on. We have to, first of all, focus on the heat source. In other words, is the fire in the kira, in this cooking utensil, a fire which is easily able to be stirred, or is there something that is preventing a person, reminding a person that he shouldn't stir the coals? Another thing we will focus on is the degree of cooking. Sometimes, even if the fire is open, and usually a person would stir the coals, but if the fire is already cooked to a certain point, so there's no concern that the person would stir the coals, as we'll soon see, because he would have no real benefit of stirring the coals. And then in addition, there's another third thing that the Chachamim spoke about, which is they focus on the type of food that you're putting up on the fire. As we'll see that there's this restriction only applies to food that stirring the coals could help it get ready for the Friday night meal. Something which stirring the coals would never be able to make the food ready for the Friday night meal. It's a type of food that would only be ready for Shabbos morning. The Chachamim were not concerned that a person might stir the coals. So we'll start with the first thing regarding the heat source, about a kira that is Grufa or ktuma. So this is a very important term that we're going to be dealing with over the next few shiurim. Grufa and ktuma is a term that's technically applied to a kira, to an old cooking utensil, the old style cooking utensils, which was, the fuel was coals. And in order to avoid the concern that one might stir the coals, there are two things a person could do. Either Grufa. Grufa means he could rake out, he could remove the coals from the fire, from the kira, from this cooking utensil. Or ktuma. Ktuma means he would cover the coals with ashes. Now, they both, you could either do Grufa, you could either do ktuma. They both help a person they both help the situation that we're not concerned that he might stir the coals. But technically they're very different. Grufa means that a person raked out, he took out all the coals. When a person takes out all the coals, then there's no real concern that he will stir the coals because there's nothing there really to stir. Now you might ask, if the coals are taken out of the oven, how could the person cook his food over there if all the coals are out? So Allah explains that even when you take out the coals, there's always going to be a few coals left. There's still going to be some heat generated in the oven. But that little bit of heat is not going to be, there won't be no real point of trying to stir the few remaining pieces of coal in the oven. There's enough heat that over time, it'll be like a slow cooking process. Over time, the food will get cooked. But it's not, there's no concern over that a person might stir the coals because most of the coal is shoveled out. So if there's no coal really there's no concern you might stir the coals. There's another way the Chachamim permitted you to leave food on the fire, which is ktuma. If a person leaves the coal in the oven, but he spreads ash over the coals, over all the coals, the purpose of which is that by sprinkling ash over all the coals, that minimizes the heat. He's minimizing the effect of the ashes. There's a layer, a coating that is containing the heat of the coals to some degree. It's not allowing it to be as intense as it was. And this covering of ashes, what it does is, there's two ways of understanding, it's a little bit different, but more or less they're similar, is that by covering the coal with ash, a person is making a gili das. He's like making a cognitive statement to himself. He's making like a declaration to himself that he's not interested in the coals burning very intensely. How does he do that? Because he's covering the coals. He's doing something which is counteracting the strength of the fire. So in his mind, for other people, for himself, he's making this realization, this declaration that I don't care about stirring the coals. From my side, on the contrary, I minimize their heat. I'm not interested in having the coals burning very intensely. Another way of looking at it is that it's a heker, it's like a recognition. By putting the coals, then serves as a reminder to the person that that he should not stoke to stir the coals. If a person does this, the halacha is this also is sufficient. He's allowed to leave uncooked food on top of the fire on Friday right before Shabbos, because since he made this declaration in his head, this gili das, he made this acknowledgement that he's not interested in the fire burning very intensely. So that is sufficient to keep him in place, to keep him from stirring the coal, after Shabbos comes in. So either condition, it's in the terminology we're going to use during the shiur, we're going to refer to it as grufa ktuma, but which is really two separate options. One is you take out the coals, and one is you cover the coals with ashes. So it's really Grufa or ktuma, but usually the halachic terminology when we speak about carving the fire, either we just use the term Grufa ktuma together. So this is the way the halacha was in the olden days. If a person raked out the coals, he covered the coals with ash, he was allowed to leave completely uncooked food on the fire right before Shabbos. There's no more concern that he might stir the coals. Now, in the case when a person puts ashes on the coal, it's very likely that won't help long term. Usually what happens is after a few minutes, if the coals are really burning strongly, that you won't even know that there was ashes put over there. But halacha says it's not a problem. Again, the point is more that a person should make a gili das. He should make a acknowledgement, a realization that he's not interested in stirring the coals. The fact that after he puts the ashes, the fire is going to go back to the way it was before, doesn't take away the fact that this person engraved in his head the point that he's not interested in stirring the coals. Now, this is one permissibility that the Chachamim instituted for a person to leave food on the fire right before Shabbos. Another condition that they instituted is if the food is already cooked to the degree of kamaichel ben derusoi. It's already cooked to the degree that it's somewhat edible. Halachically, the terminology we use is kamaichel ben derusoi, the food of ben derusoi. Ben derusoi was a robber, a bandit that used to eat his food when it was just edible. He didn't wait until his food was fully cooked. There's, I guess, different ways of understanding. I haven't really found a source why he would eat the food that way. Some people want to say he was always on the run. It's a possibility. Or maybe just bandits are usually not too civilized. They don't care to eat food when it's fully done. They're more interested in eating it at ASAP than making sure that it's fully cooked. But either way, for some reason he has some schus that his name is used in halacha, that food that reached the state of ben derusai, it's edible enough that this bandit known as ben derusai would eat it. Such food you're allowed to leave on the fire, even if you don't use the conditions of Grufa or ktuma, even if you don't take out the coals or cover the coals, you're permitted to leave the food on this fire. The reason is because once the food is basically edible, so the Chachamim weren't concerned anymore that a person will stir the coals, because technically, if the person wants, he could eat it the way it is. I mean, it's edible. It's not fully cooked, but if a person is really hungry, he could eat it the way it is. And there's no further cooking necessary if he's really hungry and wants to eat it as is. And if the person wants to eat it when it's fully cooked, which most people likely want to do, nevertheless, once it already reached the point of Maichel ben derusai, once it's already edible, it doesn't take much more cooking for it to be complete. There's no real urgency. A person doesn't feel the need to stir the coals. Once it reaches this point, usually people are just going to let it cook on its own without let the coals, finish cooking on their own without any intervention from the person. The person won't stir the coals. And therefore, once the food reached Kamaichel ben derusai, the Chacham were not concerned that a person would stir the coals. What point of cooking is Kamaichel ben derusai? So in halacha, there's two opinions. One opinion is that it's a third cooked. One opinion is that it's half cooked. L'chatchila, as a matter of course, a person should only leave food on the fire, if it's on an open fire, that is, if it's at least half cooked. But the Yeved, after the fact, if a person left food on the fire and it was a third cooked, and he left the fire open, so then, but the Yeved, after the fact, will say he's allowed to eat the food, but l'chatchila, he should make sure the food is at least half cooked. If a person left food on the fire, which was even less than Kamaichel ben derusai, it was even less than a third cooked, so then technically, according to halacha, he won't be allowed to eat the food. But that's we're going to discuss later. But right now we're focusing on what conditions permit a person to eat the food, to leave the food on the open fire, or when does he have to cover the fire? When could he leave it on an open fire? An additional exception that the Chachamim made is the type of food is raw meat, and the terminology in halacha is called ktei chayis, or raw pat, or raw meat, which is a chunk of meat like a roast, which takes a very long time to cook. And in the times of the Chachamim, at least, when they were talking about the kira, the cooking utensil that was standard in those days, such a dish would take, even if the person would stir the coals, that meat would not become ready for the Friday night meal. It would take a very long time to cook. And therefore, the Chachamim were not concerned that a person might stir the coals, because technically, stirring the coals won't really make any difference in such a case. The food is not going to be ready for Friday night, even if he stirs the coals. The meat will only be ready for Shabbos morning. And for Shabbos morning, it could cook on its own. There's no need for him to stir the coals. That amount of heat that's necessary to get ready Shabbos morning the person could happen without any person's intervention whatsoever. So therefore the Chachamim did not see the need of restricting a person from putting raw meat on the fire right before Shabbos, and even if the fire is completely open, it's exposed, it's not covered, and as long as, and even if the food is not k'ma'achal ben rusoi, it's completely raw, will be permissible. We'll discuss a few more details about this a little bit later, and we'll also discuss if it applies in today's day and age, but this was an exception that the Chachamim made in their time. So if you have any of these three conditions, that in other words, that the kira, the fire is grufa or ktuma, the food is k'ma'achal ben rusoi, or the food is this type of raw meat which is out of mind, the person doesn't really think about it, he doesn't feel the necessity to stir the coals until, because the food will be ready on its own by tomorrow, so then he's allowed to leave the food on the fire. However, in the case where the kira is not covered, kira is not grufa or ktuma, and the food is less than k'ma'achal ben rusoi, it's less than half cooked, and it's a type of food which could be ready in time for the Friday night meal, it's not raw meat, so then you're not allowed to leave it on the fire. And if you do leave it on the fire, it could be a question if the food is permissible, which we'll discuss maybe a little bit later, or maybe in another shir. Now, this is the way things were in the time of the Chachamim. In today's day and age, the cooking utensil is very different. We don't use, most people at least that I know of, do not cook on a kira, do not cook with coals. What they do is that they cook on a regular stovetop, and it's either they use, there's a gas stovetop, electric stovetop, and when you're using a regular stovetop, there's a whole discussion how do we compare the stovetop of today's day and age to the kira, to the cooking utensil which was used in the times of the Chachamim. And one fundamental difference that's probably obvious to everyone is that in the case of a kira, in the case of the old style cooking utensils and the fuel that was used, which was wood, which turned into coal, or cooking with you start cooking with coal, there's a necessity, there's a basic need to keep on stirring the coals every once in a while in order to regenerate the heat, regenerate the flame. However, when you're using a gas stovetop, electric stovetop, there's no need to play around with the knob turning up the flame, because usually if you set the flame to whatever degree to whatever temperature you want, it's going to remain on that. It's not going to automatically diminish. It's not going to automatically, the fire won't automatically turn down, which you're going to do. They'll be concerned you might have to turn it up. So technically one could argue, there's an argument brought forth, that maybe in today's day and age, there was really no need to cover the fire, because in today's day and age, the flame that we are using is not like the coals in the times of the Chachamim that would diminish on their own, and the person would have to continuously stir the coals in order to get the flame back up as it was before. But the flame, once you set the flame, is going to go on for the way it is until the food is cooked. So maybe there's no concern in the first place. Maybe a person can take a pot of completely raw food and put it on the fire and put it on top of leave it on the fire right before Shabbos, even though there's nothing covering the fire. So that is an argument that is brought forth. However, halachically, this argument is not accepted. It's accepted by across the board that even though today's day and age, our cooking utensils are not the same like in the times of the Chachamim, and arguably, logically, maybe we could say the concern of stirring the coals that applied in the times of the Chachamim do not apply in today's day and age. Nevertheless, it has been accepted by the poskim. The first real discussion about this happened not too long ago, in the last 100, 200 years, but has become accepted by the poskim that even cooking utensils which work by gas or other similar ways which the flame is always constant, nevertheless we are still concerned that maybe a person will raise the heat, which is equivalent to some, at least similar to the concern of a person will stir the coals, and therefore the fire needs to be covered. Now, I just want to point out, some people will ask, what about if I'm going to leave the flame on the highest? I'm going to turn it up all the way to the highest, and I'll put my food on such a flame. So then maybe I could leave the food on the fire. What's the concern? The concern is, there's no concern that I will raise the flame because there's nothing to raise. The flame is on the highest. There's no concern also that it might, and I'm sorry, and even if one might say there might be a concern that I'll, try to turn down the heat, I'll try to put down the fire. But that is a separate concern. The Chachamim never made a prohibition, they never prevented a person from leaving food on the fire because of the concern that a person might diminish the fire. So even though such a concern might apply, that a person might want to turn down the fire, but nevertheless, that is something which we cannot prohibit a person. If a person wants to leave a food on the fire, the only concern which we have the authority to restrict in other words, the only concern which we have the power nowadays to tell a person he has to be conscious of is the concern that the Chachamim had, that a person might raise the flame. The fact that a person might put down the flame, even such a concern exists, but we cannot make decrees on our own. If we don't find the Chachamim made this decree, we cannot on our own make this decree. So a person could argue and say, I'll leave my food on the fire on the highest temperature, and I'll put the heat all the way to the highest. So maybe in such a case, there's no concern that he might raise the heat. But nevertheless, poskim do not accept this argument. Poskim say that such a concept, as the Chacham did not, start cutting their decrees and adjusting it to each person based on the circumstances. When the Chacham made a decree, they usually made it a blanket decree. It applies in all cases. Once you start saying this person is exempt, then it already becomes something everyone could play around with. So therefore, poskim accept Allah Lamaisa that even if a person will raise the heat all the way to the highest, he's not allowed to leave a pot on the fire unless he covers the fire. Now, how could you make a Grufa or ktuma in today's stovetops? So technically, there are the option of Grufa, the option of raking out the fire, doesn't really apply. It's not like in the olden days it was coal, you're able to take out the coal. Today there's it's a gas flame. There's nothing, you can't take it out. But the option which we use is ktuma. We try to do something like the spreading out of the ashes, which they did in the times of the Chachamim, which minimized the intensity of the fire, minimized the heat of the fire. So we try to cover the fire with a blech, the metal sheet that we put over the fire, known as a blech, which serves as a very similar, identical purpose as the ashes did in the times of the Chachamim. It's covering the fire, so it serves as a gilui das, as a recognition, a mental recognition that the person's not interested in the intensity of the fire. We could also call it a heker, it's a recognition that's reminding a person he shouldn't turn up the flame. However exactly you want to explain it, both interpretations seem to be part of the idea of ktuma. But either way, we don't have Grufa today. We don't have an option of taking out the fire, really. We have an option of covering the fire. So we call it, as I mentioned before, we're going to call it Grufa ktuma, but technically what we mean is that it's really ktuma. Today's day and age, when we cover the fire, it's ktuma. So the idea of a blech is, like I mentioned before, is taken from the idea of ktuma at the times of the Chachamim, that they would cover the fire with ashes. And that's what we do today. We cover the fire with a blech. So if a person puts food on top of a blech, so technically the food could be any type of food. It could be completely raw as long as it's on the fire and the fire is covered. There's no problem leaving food on the blech. Now, there is a discussion of what exactly do you have to cover on a modern stovetop. So there are 2 points of that you could focus on. There's the flame and there's the knobs. So most standard blechs usually there's a sheet of metal that covers the fire, and it also extends down on the side, which covers the knobs. Now, this is the standard blech that they have today. The olden blechs, not necessarily that's the way it was just a plain sheet of metal. And there is a discussion amongst the poskim what exactly is necessary. So the consensus of most poskim, it seems across the board, at least the majority of poskim, is that the most important thing is to cover the fire. So just like in the times of the Chachamim, when they covered the coals, so with ashes, the coals were the fire, that was the source of fire. So similarly, in today's day and age, you would take this metal sheet, the main thing is that it should cover the fire, And this way we have a recognition, we have something that is telling us that we don't want the intensity of the heat, and we're not concerned that a person might play around with the knob, turn up the flame. There is a discussion if it's necessary to also cover the knobs. Some people say everyone holds that it's best to cover the knobs. The question is if it's absolutely necessary to also cover the knobs, because unlike the times of the Chachamim, where they just covered the fire and that was it, in today's day and age there's the flame and there's also the knobs. So in today's day and age, if we also have knobs, so is it enough just to cover the flame, or one also has to cover the knobs? So some poskim require one to cover the knobs. Other poskim say that it's best to cover the knobs, it's not absolutely necessary. But it's always advisable to cover both. I would also mention that, I wouldn't say this as a psak halacha, as a halachic ruling, but my uncle, Rabbi Shalom Groner from South Africa, told me that his father-in-law, Rabbi Popek from Philadelphia, Alav Shalom, spoke once to the Rebbe, before the Rebbe was Rebbe, about this, and the Rebbe told him that, he says that people make a mistake, they think the main thing is to cover the fire. The Rebbe felt the main thing was to actually cover the knobs. Now again, the Rebbe didn't say this as a halachic ruling, but it highlights, it emphasizes the importance a person should definitely try as much as possible to cover the knobs as well. If the blech does not extend over the knobs, then a person at least should take off the knobs or put tape down the knobs, or at least a bare minimum to cover them with something. So like this, he's covered on both ends. Before we spoke about the first condition and how you're allowed to leave food on the fire before Shabbos, which is making the kira Grufa or ktuma, leaving a blech on the fire. Such a case, you could leave any type of food on the fire. What about a kira which is not Grufa or ktuma? What about the other permissibilities we mentioned before? So as we saw before, in addition to making the fire Grufa or ktuma, covering the fire, there are other conditions that would permit a person to leave food on the fire before Shabbos, such as if the food is cooked to the degree of Meichel ben Derusoi. So if a pot of food is cooked to the degree that it's Meichel ben Derusoi, that it's that is, as I mentioned before, a half cooked, then you're allowed to leave it on the fire before Shabbos without putting any blech, without doing anything. So that is the basic halacha. I would, however, mention a few points to consider. First of all, there is an opinion in the Gemara which holds that even if food is already k'maichel ben derusay, but it's not fully cooked, and furthermore, even if it's fully cooked, but the more it stays on the fire, the better it tastes, like chont or other types of dishes. So there's an opinion in the Gemara that requires there to be a blech even in such a case. Lahalacha, we do not follow this opinion. The Rebbe writes that the minig became to follow the more lenient opinion that a blech is only required if the food is not k'maichel ben derusay, if the food didn't yet reach the half point of cooking. But nevertheless, there's definitely some type of advantage, value, chumrah, zehirus, however you want to call it. There's definitely there is a reason to have a blech, even if the food is already cooked k'maichel ben derusay, and even if it's completely cooked, if the food tastes better. If the food tastes better, the longer it stays in the fire. Another point to keep in mind is that technically, just for safety reasons, you would probably want to have a blech, because once the fire is on let's say regular gas stovetop, you're not going to be able to turn off the fire over Shabbos. So, I mean, if you're leaving food, let's say, inside of an oven, and it's already k'maichel ben derusay, and you're not, so in the oven you put on a timer that will go off, so that's okay. But in a regular stovetop, if you're going to leave a fire on, it's probably going to be dangerous. And you probably just going to have a blech for safety reasons. There's another point I want to mention, which is just very important to keep in mind. A lot of people don't necessarily understand the exact need for a blech, and therefore they don't realize what they could do, they can't do on a blech. A person, as we mentioned before, a person is allowed to leave food on the fire even if it's completely raw, as long as he has a blech. However, despite the fact that he has a blech, he still has to be aware that there are a number of activities, we might call standard activities, that will be strong, that will be prohibited, even though he has a blech. And I'll explain to you what I mean. As long as the food is not fully cooked, we already learned previously in the malacha of bishul, as long as the food is not fully cooked, any activity that a person does that accelerates, that quickens the process of its cooking is prohibited, minat, is prohibited biblically. So for example, like we discussed, if let's say a person puts a cover on top of a pot that's on the fire. So in such a case, the pot is on the fire, it would cook, but putting the cover on top of the food causes it to cook quicker. So if the food is not fully cooked, it will be prohibited to put a cover back on top of the pot that's on the fire. Now, if let's say in the case of a blech, if a person has a pot that's not fully cooked that he leaves on the blech, and he wants to move the pot closer to the fire on Shabbos. So it's a very big problem. The person has to be careful to make sure that the food is completely cooked before he does such a thing. If the food is not completely cooked and he's going to move the pot of food closer to the fire, despite the fact that there's a blech, nevertheless a person is violating a biblical prohibition. He's violating the blech of bishul min haTorah. He's violating the biblical prohibition of cooking because he's doing an activity which is hastening, it's quickening the cooking process. If the pot is already fully cooked, then technically he could move it closer to the fire, but there are some halachas of moving around foods around the blech, which we'll discuss in another shir. So that's, first of all, it's very important to be aware of that. So a lot of times, for example, the person puts 1 or 2 burners on top of his stovetop, and he puts 2 or 4, 3, 4 pots on his blech. What he does is let's say, puts right on top of the burner, he's going to put the pots that he needs for Friday night, the soup, the chicken, whatever else he has, and those pots that he needs for Shabbos day, like the cholent or other things that he's going to use Shabbos day, he puts a little further away from the fire. And Friday night, when he removes the soup, he removes the chicken, he moves the cholent pot closer to the fire. It's a standard procedure that's done in many homes. A person has to be careful, to be aware, to make sure that the cholent is 100% cooked before he puts it closer to the fire. Now, if he wants to check if the cholent is cooked, he could do so, but if he's going to pick up the pot, the cover of the pot, and he'll see that his cholent is not fully cooked, he will not be able to put the cover back on, as I just explained. So basically, a person just has to be aware of the issues that could come up with moving things closer to the fire. Furthermore, if let's say a person wants to move a pot further away from the fire, he wants to move the pot of cholent away from the fire. So then if the pot is not fully cooked, the only thing he would be allowed to do is he would be allowed to slide the pot away from the fire. If he would pick up the pot and move it across the blech and put it down, so if he was putting it down, there's still heat that could cook the pot to some degree, he's violating a biblical prohibition of bishul, because the second he picked it up from the fire, at that point it's suspended in the air, it won't cook. When he's going to put it back down a little further down on the blech, at that point it's considered as if he's putting it down on the fire for the first time, because right beforehand it was in the air. He interrupted the process of cooking, and now he's starting it anew by putting it down on the end of, further down on the blech. So it would be violating a biblical prohibition of bishul. So it's important to realize that the blech doesn't cover all fronts. It's only there to protect the person from violating the prohibition of leaving food on the fire, in order that there shouldn't be the concern that he might raise the flame or stir the coals. But there could be other prohibitions a person has to be very, very well aware of that apply even if the food is on the blech, and blech is properly done, is covering the knob, is covering the fire, but there could be an issue of doing things which accelerate the cooking process of the pot, which would be also min haTorah, which would be prohibited biblically, and the blech would not help for that. So for this reason, there were some people that were careful, or I guess ideally, they wanted all their food to be fully cooked before Shabbos, even if they're going to leave it on a blech. Because, like to avoid any blunders that people might not be aware of, or whatever it is, in order to avoid these issues of people moving things closer to the fire and so on and so forth, they wanted the food to be completely cooked before Shabbos. This is not a halachic obligation. Halachically, if you have a blech, you can leave completely raw food on it, but nevertheless, it's something to be aware of, something to keep in mind, that, if you would want to, make sure that people are aware of the halachas that relate to a blech, and if you're concerned that, you might forget, or someone else might forget in your house, it might be advisable, if possible, to try to make sure the food is completely cooked before Shabbos. Now, the third condition, which we mentioned before, which would allow something to stay on the fire before Shabbos, even if there's no blech, is raw meat. Now, the heter of raw meat has very specific qualifications. First of all, it can't be just, ground beef. It has to be like a big chunk of meat, a real big piece that takes a long time to cook. it would have to be done right before Sheiya, right before Shabbos starts. And as I mentioned before, it really does not, this permissibility does not really apply in today's day and age. The reason is because the permissibility of leaving a chunk of raw meat on the fire was allowed in the times of the Chachamim, because in those days the heat of the kira was not as strong as our stovetops today. So therefore, what would happen is that even if a person would stir the coals Friday night, the raw meat would not become ready for the Friday night meal. It would only become ready, early Shabbos morning, and it would be ready in time for the Shabbos day meal. So technically, the Chachamim said there's no reason to be concerned that a person might stir the coals in this case. Why? Because for Friday night, even if he stirs the coals the whole time, it's not going to get ready for Friday night. And for Shabbos morning, it will get ready without him doing anything. There was enough heat. Even if the coals are dimmed and they're not burning so strongly, but there's enough heat that's generated that over the whole night, the meat will get ready in time for Shabbos morning. So the Chacham were not concerned that a person might stir the coals. In today's day and age, our stovetops, the fire, it's a stronger fire, it's more intense. A roast doesn't take a whole night to get ready on a regular stovetop today's day and age. So after a few hours, it's ready. It could be ready for the Friday night meal. So therefore, the permissibility as it applied in the times of the Chachamim does not really relate to today's day and age when our procedure of cooking is very different, and there is concern even with the roast of meat that a person might raise the flame. Therefore, what the Chachamim instituted, in today's day and age, a lot of poskim hold, most poskim hold that the permissibility of raw meat does not apply. But there is one exception. The exception would be if a person is using a crock pot, which the highest setting on the crock pot is not very strong, and if you would cook the meat even on the highest setting of this crock pot, it would not get ready for the Friday night meal. So if today somebody has a cooking utensil which is not as intense as the regular stovetops that he's using today, but it's a slow cooker, and the highest temperature, there's different types of slow cookers out there, the highest temperature would not be intense enough to cook the meat unless it's going to stay on the whole night. So then we're back to square one. Then he could, in such a case, he could use this crock pot to cook his meat, because in this particular cooking utensil, there's no concern that he would raise the flame, because he's not going to gain anything by raising the flame. Because even on the highest temperature, the highest setting of this crock pot, the meat will not get ready until way past the Friday night meal. So this is what you see on this slide, and where it says the flame size, that it only applies to a flame that can cook the meat in time for Friday night, even if left on the highest temperature. So this would not really apply to regular stovetop in today's day and age. Now, there are a number of different types of cooking utensils that are used in today's day and age, and I'll try to cover some of the basic laws of Grufa and ktuma, how they apply to those cooking utensils. So let's start with a hot water urn. A hot water urn, there's different types of hot water urns. A hot water urn, there's a very basic type that it's on or off, which means there's no different temperature settings. You just plug it in and it's on. You take out the plug, it's off, or there's a switch on or off. It doesn't go more than that. And some crock pots also, very basic old style crock pots that are not very, advanced. It's just on or off. Such a type of utensil, poskim say, you don't need to do anything to make it grufa or ktuma, because by its very design, there's no way of raising the flame, raising the temperature. If it's just on or off, then what are we concerned? That he might turn it off? There's nothing to do with the concern that the Chachamim had that a person might stir the coals. We're not concerned about that. We cannot, even if we would be concerned about it, we won't have the authority to prevent someone from doing it because of this concern. We cannot create our own concerns that the Chachamim did not mention. So in such a case, in a type of cooking utensil, let's say hot water in a crock pot, or even a hot plate that is just on or off, so there's no concern of, you could put food right before Shabbos in such a water, you could put water in hot water and food in the crock pot right before Shabbos. There's no concern of raising the flame. Now, if there are different temperature settings, so in the case of a hot water urn, it really gets tricky, because in a hot water urn, there usually, as I mentioned before, we would try to cover the source of heat. On a gas stove, we would cover the fire. In an oven, we'll soon discuss, we cover, according to some at least, you would cover the heating elements. But in that order, and you can't really cover the heating element. The heating element is submerged within the water. It's not really possible to do Grufa ktuma on it. The only thing you could do is you could tape down the knob if it has different temperature settings when you need to do something. So this goes back to our original argument, the argument we mentioned before, or the different ways of looking at it. What is the main thing that is necessary? The main thing is necessary to cover the heating element, the fire, or to cover the knobs. As I mentioned before, most poskim, the majority of poskim accept that the main thing is covering the heating element, covering the fire. So according to them, hot water that has different temperature settings, you should not put water in there right before Shabbos unless it already gets cooked halfway, it's heated up before Shabbos. If you, again, like you mentioned, the Rebbe, and maybe some other minority opinions which seem to hold that the main focus is the knob itself, so then technically you could make it Grufa or ktuma if you're going to tape down the knob, or some of them have the ability to pull off the knob, which makes it very hard to play around with temperature settings. So it would be definitely best advisable, in order to do things according to all opinions, to make sure that the water is already heated up before Shabbos. Now technically you only have to make sure that the water is heated up halfway before Shabbos. The question, however, is, what does it mean halfway? Let's say you want water to be hot to reach 100 degrees, let's say. So half of that is 50 degrees, which is room temperature or less. So heating water up to half the amount of soy that it's halfway done, it's very hard to understand what that means. Does that mean half of the temperature? You can't say it's half the temperature, because half of 100 is 50, which is nothing, which is room temperature or even worse. So it gets very hard to ascertain exactly what does it mean. I mean, you could say that if, let's say, it's now the temperature of the water is 60 degrees and you want it to reach 100, so 80 degrees would be halfway. It's a possibility, but it's a little tricky. That's why some poskim say it's best to make sure the water is heated up to the extent that, it could definitely be considered hot by all opinions before Shabbos starts. Now, a hot plate, usually it's just on or off, so there's really, like I mentioned before, it's by its default, it's Grufa or ktuma. If there are different temperature settings, there is different opinions regarding such a situation of a hot plate. What exactly is a hot plate considered something they usually cook on or not? We will discuss this in another shiur. We're not going to dwell on it right now. I will focus now on an oven. If you want to make Grufa or ktuma in an oven. So some people, they leave a few pots inside the oven Friday night, and so if the food is if the food is already halfway cooked, they could leave it in without doing anything. However, a person has to be aware there's other issues leaving food inside an oven. If you're, let's say, going to open the oven door and a light will go on, or the thermostat might go on right away, then you're running into other shilas of unrelated to the issue of raising the flame, but there's other concerns, turning on a light, if the thermostat would be sensitive to the opening up of the oven, and there would be an immediate increase in the flame, that would be asur min haTorah, it would be prohibited biblically. Another thing you have to be aware of is that if you're leaving food inside an oven, and let's say you have two pots, and you're taking out one pot and leaving in another pot, that other pot is not fully cooked yet. You would not be allowed to close the door on that pot that's not fully cooked, because now that you open the door, the cooking process will take much more time for that pot to get cooked, because now the door is open. When you close the door, you're causing the food now to get cooked quicker, because beforehand the door was open. At that point, it would take much longer for the food to get cooked. Now you're closing the door, you're causing it to get cooked much quicker. So that's other issues. Again, there's potential blunders that could develop, and there are ways of working around it. You can put the oven on a timer, and then when the oven is off, so some of these problems are taken away. There's also a Shabbos mode. Some ovens have a Shabbos mode which neutralize some of these problems. The question, however, is, does a Shabbos mode make it Grufa or ktuma? So I'm not, I don't know every single type of oven that's out there. The way I understand is different types of Shabbos modes. Certain Shabbos modes that is just a press of a button. With one press of a button, it turns into Shabbos mode. Another press of a button, it's off Shabbos mode. So a number of poskim hold that if the Shabbos mode is just a switch from one to the other, it's not very simple to do. So then the Shabbos mode in of itself cannot render the oven Grufa or ktuma, because since it's you could just easily switch it back to regular weekday mode and then raise the flame. If it's just a click of a button, a press of a button, so then it's not really preventing you from raising the flame. It's not really considered strong enough to be considered a blech. But there are certain Shabbos modes where you understand that it's not so easy to just revert it back to weekday mode. It's a whole process. In such a case, it would probably be considered Grufa or ktuma by having the oven on a Shabbos mode. But if for an oven that doesn't have that type of Shabbos mode, so then making it Grufa or ktuma, if the food is not k'maycha ben d'resoi, if the food is not halfway cooked and you need to cover the heating elements, so the poskim disagree as to exactly what is needed to be done. They all agree that just the fact that the heating element at the bottom of the oven is by default it's covered, that doesn't render it Grufa or ktuma. I mean, that's just the design of the oven, that the heating element is not exposed. So that doesn't render it Grufa or ktuma by default, because there's no real recognition that the person is doing that will prevent them from raising the flame, because every day this is the way the oven looks. Some people say it's sufficient to put some silver foil or something to cover the bottom of the oven where the heating elements are coming from, and if there's heating elements on the side, to put some on the side as well. And although technically the silver foil is not really minimizing the heat, because it's, if the oven has a thermostat, and even if the silver foil would minimize the heat on its own to some degree, but the thermostat is just going to cause the oven to work more to counter effect to counter any effect that the silver foil might have had. Nevertheless, some poskim seem to hold that this is sufficient, because it's a recognition a person is doing something that at least from his viewpoint, he's doing an activity to tell himself he's not interested in the intensity of the heat. It's not everyone agrees with this. Some people say that to make a Grufa or ktuma in the oven, it would be necessary to have like a metal box, have a metal insert that it's, so to say, this metal insert serves as a strong block between the oven and the heat of the oven to the food. So if you have I don't know if they sell these metal boxes around, but hypothetically, if there would be a metal box that you would open up and you would put the food in and cover it, so then that will be a sufficient type of Grufa or ktuma, because this box definitely serves as a barrier, as the heat of the oven is definitely minimized once the food, it minimizes the heat of the oven getting into the food. So that is regarding making an oven Grufa or ktuma. A crock pot, make a crock pot Grufa or ktuma, is basically, to do it the best way would require two steps. One is that you would put silver foil inside the crock pot, line it with silver foil, and have the silver foil extend on the outside. And also tape down the knob, pull off the knob at a bare minimum to cover the knob. As we mentioned before, to cover both aspects, the knob and the heating elements. Again, as a bare minimum, in other words, a person try to cover the inside and the outside, but as a bare minimum, sometimes there are people that are not ready to go all the way, or they're trying to teach other people the laws of Shabbos, and the other people not willing to go all the way. As a bare minimum, at least to pull off the knob, but I would suggest at least to pull off the knob or tape down the knob, so there shouldn't be concern of playing around with the temperature settings. Now, some people would say, putting on the food in the crock pot only to be ready for Shabbos morning. Why should I care about raising the flame? But halachically, that's not. You still required to make it Grufa or ktuma, to do something to cover the flame. We'll now do some Shulchan Aruch. We will do some of the halachas inside in the Rebbe Shulchan Aruch on the laws of Sheiya. Okay, the Rebbe says, this is Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, 253.1. Kira she'asuya ke'en k'deira gedola. A kira which is made like a big pot, like a big box. In the sikin oisa b'seichal shulah, you would heat up, you would put the coals on the bottom of this box, You would put a pot on top of this, 2 pots on top of it. It would be this, like you saw in the picture before, there was 2 openings on top which you would put the pots. It is long and narrow. On top there's room to put 2 pots. So the halachas are, technically in halach in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is where these halachas originate, there's a lot of discussion of different types of cooking utensils. There's a kira, there's a tanur, there's an oven, there's a kupach. A kupach was like a kira. Was only enough room to cook 1 pot. And there's also differences of type of fuel you used. If you used straw or you used wood. But halachically, all those other cooking utensils and other types of fuel that we use are not really relevant to our day stovetops. Halachically, we follow the halachas that relate to a kira. The Rebbe says in Huska v'gefes, in the 3rd line, if it was heated up with gefes upsela shel zaysim, which is after you finish squeezing the olives for oil, so the leftover pulp from the olives, it would sometimes be used as fuel, or be'etzim, or with wood. You're not allowed to put a pot of food on Friday to leave it on the fire for the sake of the Friday night meal or the Shabbos day meal. If the food is not yet cooked to the extent of kamachal ben derusoi, to the extent of halfway cooked, the food that the robber ben derusoi would eat as food, when Shabbos comes in. In other words, the important point in time that you have to focus on is not if at the time you're putting on the food, if it reached kamachal ben derusoi at that time. Let's say you're putting on the food a half hour before Shabbos. At this point, it's not kamachal ben derusoi, but you know that once Shabbos will come, once Shabbos will start, once it will be sunset, at that point it will definitely be kamachal ben derusoi. So you're okay. The point is, when Shabbos comes, will the food already have reached kamachal ben derusoi before Shabbos? That's okay. If the food will not have reached kamachal ben derusoi when Shabbos comes in, when sunset takes place, so then you have a problem. You would have to do you would have to cover the fire, do the other, as Alter will discuss so. Pirush Shem Adam Listim She'ochel Tav Shiloi After Dialing is Pashakot Tzarcha. Ben derusoi is the name of a robber who used to eat his food, even though it was not fully cooked. So he's not allowed to leave it on the fire. Shema Yechata Yachta Pirushim Nar V'Yapecha Gecholim B'Machta B'Shabbos Simur B'Shulei. We're afraid, this is a terminology Allah uses, we're afraid Shema Yechata, a person might stir the coals with whatever he uses, the stick that they used to use to stir the coals, in order to cause the food to get finished on time. Unless Alim Keina Kira in Grufa, unless the Kira, this cooking utensil is Grufa Dainu Shegora Fimena Kolega Cholum Lechutz, which means that he raked out all the coals outwards, that he took out all the coals. Oishi ktuma, or it is covered, he covered the coals with ashes to minimize the heat. It doesn't have to put so much ashes until you can't tell at all that there's fire over there. It's enough to put a little bit of ashes. Now, he doesn't mean to put a little bit of ashes on one coal. He means you put ashes over all the coals, but you only put a thin layer, which doesn't really do much. Even though later the coals reignited, the flame once again rose up on its own, it's not a problem. The kivan shegila daita mi beit yoim, since Gila daita, he made a gilei das. He revealed that his opinion, that his intent is that he doesn't need the coals. He revealed this intent before Shabbos. We're not concerned anymore that he might stoke the coals on Shabbos. Coals that diminished are like ktuma, they're covered with fire. Now these halachas, by the way, only apply to a pot of food on the fire. A person is roasting food on the fire. A person is making a barbecue. The halachas are very different than they're discussed and in the later simon. This is only a pot on the fire, and then we go by Michael ben Derusoi and so on and so forth. Reish Nun Gimel Zayin. So Reish Nun Gimel Beis, the Rebbe speaks about if you use other fuel, which we don't really use today, they shouldn't be muzayim al Rebbe Bryce tanurim shalonu shepischa min atzad and havon ruba kol cham kol kach kevel tana shebimeim. Our ovens, in the olden days, the ovens were shaped like a cone, and the heat was very intense. The halachas of leaving food in such an oven was different. But our ovens today, that you open them up from the side and the heat is not as intense as the ovens in those days. It also wasn't as intense. A kupach was a smaller cooking utensil, which was, since it was narrow, the heat built up more. But the point is that today our ovens, all our cooking utensils, halachically have the status of akira, and we follow the halachas that Shulchan Aruch says regarding how you could leave food on akira for Shabbos.